So for our final session, we're going to bring Jonathan Weiner back up here. Before we start, though, as I said at the beginning, this was an enormously complicated conference to put together. And in the middle of the night, when I had a complete panic or a difficult question, there's two people who I wanted to recognize as always responding with very good advice. And one was Jonathan Weiner, and the other is Jim Hammond. And I'd like to say thank you to both of them for helping making this happen. Jonathan is now going to lead off a panel that will conclude the conference by telling us where we're all going.
Thank you, Lisa. And before we start the concluding roundtable, I just want to begin by asking all of you to join me in thanking Lisa Robinson for organizing a terrific conference. She really has knocked herself out working on this since January and done a marvelous job at pulling together what has been a scintillating series of sessions. And now I also want to repeat my invitation to all of you to attend the Society for Risk Analysis annual meeting in December in Baltimore, 6th through 9th. And Warner North and I checked today and found that we're at liberty to announce that in significant part due to Warner's efforts, that one of the keynote plenary speakers at that SRA conference will be Ken Arrow. So look forward to seeing you all there. Please visit us at sra.org. Now we have our concluding roundtable, and we have an esteemed group of commenters to talk about the issues that have come up in the conference so far, and also the issues that we haven't raised yet. Alternative perspectives, additional challenges, additional opportunities. What we're going to do is try to have a very much a group discussion. We're going to do that in a couple of ways. One is that each of the members of the concluding roundtable is just going to give 4 or 5 minutes of initial comments to stimulate discussion rather than a full presentation. And then we'll have open discussion with the entire room. And Mark, who's near the back, who's been passing the microphone around. I'm sorry. Oh, and Jun in the front also will bring the microphone to you, so you don't have to line up at the side for this session, so that it's a more convivial discussion. I'm really delighted that we have with us this outstanding group of experts on regulatory oversight, regulatory review, impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis, and policy making. Starting at the far end of the table, John Graham, Dean of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, formerly, as you know, administrator of OMB OIRA. Next to John is Michael Livermore from New York University and the Institute for Public Integrity. Has written a series of articles and a book with Ricky Revesz on regulatory oversight. Then Rena Steinzer from the law school at the University of Maryland, and also the president of the Center for Progressive Reform, a group of legal and related scholars who have written significantly on cost-benefit analysis and often critical of cost-benefit analysis. Then Dick Morgenstern, here from from Resources for the Future, and formerly longtime Director of Policy Analysis at US EPA. And I mentioned yesterday the book that Dick Morgenstern, Winston Harrington, and Lisa Heinzerling have recently produced on trying to find common ground between advocates and critics of cost-benefit analysis. And then closest to me here, Richard Zerbe from the University of Washington, who is also leading the new Society for Benefit Cost Analysis. So really pleased to have you all here. And why don't we start in the order I just went? Start with John Graham.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon. The task I was assigned was, if the Obama administration were to redo a presidential executive order on regulatory analysis, what should be in it? And I can assure you that my advice may get the least weight on this panel. The first observation I would make is that it's not obvious to me that you should try to redo such an executive order. As an academic, you have control over the things you write, and you don't publish the things you don't believe in. When you're involved in the government, you can start a process, but sometimes the executive order doesn't end up looking like the first draft that you produced. So unless you have some good confidence that you can produce something constructive, sometimes it's better to run with what you have. And there's a lot of good in the Clinton-Gore executive order, which is what the Bush administration operated under through its 8 years. But if we're going to do some new things in it, I have my own 3 candidates, and they are as follows. 1, time for an equity test. Of course, we've been doing cost-benefit analysis with sort of an implicit societal-wide Cowler-Hicks test being underlying this. It seems to me that we're at a stage now where we should explicitly bring in an equity test. I would propose something that's fairly specific and rigorous, such as identifying low-income populations measured by the poverty line or some multiple of the poverty line as the Rawlsian least advantaged population, and then making a factual determination as to whether each regulation is good for society as a whole, and is it also good for this least advantaged population. If not, it does not necessarily mean to no rule, though in some cases that may be the appropriate outcome. But it may lead to certain corrective measures, such as under the Safe Drinking Water Act, certain subsidies for low-income communities, or it merely may over time create an information base on how regulatory policies are impacting the most vulnerable and least advantaged members of the population. I know there was some discussion of these ideas. I'm not in favor of the highly complicated, weighted social welfare functions, but Scott Farrow's more simple approach, I think, would be something that would be, I think, quite attractive. Second of all, time for more international collaboration in regulatory policy. I was at OIRA in the area where we were doing our best to get genetically modified seeds into the European Union and much of the rest of the world. We didn't do very well. And even though we won some litigation in the World Trade Organization, we learned that the remedies at the WTO were not very effective. And one of the lessons I drew from this experience is that there's a very high payoff when regulatory policy is at the formative stages in different parts of the globe for the United States to be proactive and to be engaged in dialogue with our international comrades. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that we were busily formulating the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation and running it through the Congress at record speed without very much consultation with our European colleagues and business firms in Europe. And as a consequence, we wrote a pretty clumsy and not very considerate piece of legislation from the perspective of firms abroad who were thinking about listing themselves on the New York Stock Exchange and so forth. I think also our relationships with China are at a critical stage where a lot of dialogue, informal as well as formal, is appropriate. And you see now throughout the world the rising sentiments for various forms of protectionism. In France, for example, we're going to subsidize our car companies, but only if they agree only to shut down plants that are outside the borders of France. They have to keep them going if they're in France, apparently. But these kinds of sentiments are going to find their way into a whole range of regulatory policies, and it's important that groups like the OMB and OIRA and their analogs around the world recognize that a lot of good-looking, well-intentioned health, safety, and environmental policy may in fact be forms of trade restriction that need to have serious scrutiny. One modest step in this direction would be for OECD to convene regularly the OIRA officials from the various countries and regions of the world and have them share notes on what's happening on the more mischievous side of regulatory policy as well as that which is well-intended and constructive. Final and third point is it's time for OMB to get into the financial regulatory reform business. Now, the conventional wisdom, as many of you know in this area, is this is too important and sensitive to allow OMB, a White House office, to be involved in financial regulation. So clearly things like environmental protection and public health protection and safety, these things are not that important and sensitive. But financial regulation, oh my God, we wouldn't let them get their hands on that. Now, the truth of the matter is that the White House has a perception, not just this White House's, many previous White Houses, have this perception that they can evade political accountability for the state of the economy by acting as if the Federal Reserve Board is sort of over there and we don't have any accountability for the decisions they make. And the current thinking seems to be to give the Federal Reserve Board even more power over these regulatory issues. My own view is that the president, this president particularly, will be held accountable for the state of the economy, and that we ought to give the president the authority to actually oversee the implementation of a lot of this well-intended legislation around financial regulatory reform. Given that the president needs to be able to lead in order to make things happen, we shouldn't have this big pretension that we're going to have all these other units out there do it, and the president will only take credit for it if it works, and the president will say, I wasn't involved if in fact it doesn't work out so well. So those are my three items for consideration. If you want the detailed version, it's in the Pennsylvania Law Review, which there are copies of out here, and it's great airplane reading or sleeping material.
Thank you, John. Michael.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. In reflecting a bit on this conference and in directions for the future, I was certainly struck by here the many fertile areas of research and ideas for how cost-benefit analysis can be expanded and improved. But I was also, I think, struck by the need to build a real political constituency in favor of cost-benefit analysis done well. I think that right now that constituency does not necessarily exist. And just as a kind of Exhibit A, we know that Cass Sunstein hasn't been confirmed. His final confirmation hasn't happened, even though he's cleared the Senate committee. And that would never happen for an administrator of an office that had greater kind of political constituency. You couldn't imagine EPA kind of having their administrator kind of sitting around waiting for confirmation to take a floor vote on a confirmation. So I think that so that need does not exist. If you look at the comments on the call for comments and the responses to the call for comments on the potential new executive order, there remains a dynamic where, to the extent that you see a real constituency in favor of cost-benefit analysis, that is still folks that tend to have more of a skeptical eye on regulation. Industry trade groups are very much in favor of maintaining strong regulatory review, cost-benefit analysis. There certainly were groups that tolerate cost-benefit analysis, but the real political constituency, to the extent that it existed, was very much on one side of the political spectrum. Now, of course, the president, our president now, President Obama, is clearly going to have an ambitious regulatory agenda. He's quite clearly going to give increased attention to regulatory review and cost-benefit analysis. That's clearly going to take a central place in the administration, and that counts. That's true for regulation. The president has often also given an indication that's going to play a role in particular policy areas, like, for example, in health care. Cost considerations are going to be playing a major role in the future. And so, and again, I do think that there is a latent demand, a latent political constituency for improved and well-done cost-benefit analysis. In the last presidential election, the current president got a lot of mileage out of claims that he was a pragmatic decision maker. He was a non-ideological decision maker. Worries about government competence, just doing their jobs well, I think was an important factor in the presidential election and an important consideration of this administration. So to the extent that cost-benefit analysis and regulatory review fits within that framework of simply making government better, aside from whatever the ends of government are, but achieving those ends in a more straightforward and a less costly way, I think that there really can be a very powerful constituency for cost-benefit analysis, and that political constituency will be what empowers the community of experts to really make serious improvements in the process, expand into other areas, expand into other questions like equity, reach out to other countries in a way that is persuasive. And so I think building that political constituency, just in another key example of where cost-benefit considerations are not front and center, at least for the time being, is if you look in a political process is in Congress right now in considerations of the climate change legislation, where the allocation, in the particular, the allocation of permits, where there's nearly universal agreement that auctioning permits would be the way to go, and a very large piece of agreement about kind of, at least within bounds, how you would want to distribute those, the proceeds of an auction, and that is very much not the way that Congress is going. And really, quite frankly, that wasn't much debated in Congress, even though there was certainly fairly widespread agreement among experts. So I think in the next 4 to 8 years that's going to be a major challenge, both for the community of experts and also just for the larger community of folks that care about kind of rational decision-making. Government is building that political constituency that can power the movement forward.
Thank you, Mike. Rena. Yes, please.
Well, I really appreciate being invited here. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, and I can't say I understood what gamma is. I sort of had a general sense of it, but I'm going to define my role as visiting from another planet to tell you what I think are some of the issues that you didn't raise, and that is what Jonathan had invited us to do, and I'm the perfect one to do it, let me tell you. First, I'd like to agree with John's prediction, perhaps we can start a pool, that 12866 won't change in the final analysis. I went to Cass Sunstein's nomination hearing, and I think there is now a sense, perhaps, that rather than write a whole new thing and take a whole new round of criticism, that they just stick with what they had. So we'll see if we're right. I'm making this prediction. It sort of is like one of those news commentator shows. If anyone's interested in a prediction market, I'll be outside after the conversation. If it does change, or as it's implemented, the one thing that I think my group would really like to see, we're very critical of the methodology. We're among the leading critics probably inside the Beltway. But if we're going to have CBA here to stay, we'd like to have it be used when we deregulate as well as when we regulate. That's something that I think did not always happen in the past. And it certainly is a very good point that Michael made from his lips to the ears of the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate, that it would be a very good idea for some of the opponents of the climate change legislation to actually consider why they are not auctioning. Of course, we all know the reason for that, but which is that they are getting more and more stuck in the muck and having harder and harder time pushing that legislation forward. But were they to follow your rational ideas in that context, I think we'd be all very pleased. The one thing that struck me that nobody mentioned today is the state of the agencies that all of this oversight is going to apply to. And the reason I found that pretty surprising is that it is the preoccupation of anybody who is familiar with them, from their appointees to their most prominent industry critics to their overseers on Capitol Hill to the public interest groups that are concerned about their performance. All of the agencies that protect health and safety are in shambles, and I use that word very deliberately. EPA is probably in the best shape of them all, and yet the Government Accountability Office has said that EPA will have great difficulty managing and implementing any climate change legislation at all because it is so short of resources and its management structure is so confused, and it doesn't have the right expertise on its staff. When you look at an agency like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which has not regulated a chemical in the workforce more than twice in the last decade, where there is rules in effect, for example, for crane collapses that were written in 1971, Or you look at the Food and Drug Administration and the problem with food safety, which is disturbing Congress so much. 20% of our food is imported from countries like China where there is no regulation really in effect much at all, except sporadically. So when you look at the full range, we could talk about the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which has had an increase in funding but is presiding with a situation where they have 15 inspectors for all the imports of consumer products into this country, including 80% of the toys that are sold in America, which are also primarily manufactured in China, where, for example, lead paint is less expensive than safe paint because they have one of the world's largest lead mines there. When we look at these things, and I'm giving you statistics, I could talk about peanut butter, we could go there. I think the question for OIRA and for the regulatory czar is how to get these agencies back on track, how to get them to pull themselves together, make the best of the scarce resources that they have, and make them more effective. Find regulatory tools that can be used when you have such a gap between funding and the cost of implementation. And that's what I really hope that Cass Sunstein will put his considerable intellect to do. One of the most encouraging developments, and I'm going to prove myself a nerd, even though I am a lefty nerd, one of the most encouraging things is Peter Orszag's pledge to use the performance assessment and rating tool. Many of you know this. It's called PART. It is an assessment of the budgets of the agencies and how they're doing in implementing their various programs. He is going to try and revamp that to really identify regulatory failures in a much more sort of concerted way and figure out what to do about them. The only other point I'd make along these lines, as wishing to raise this subject for you, is that there is also a tremendous gap in science, and I didn't hear too many people mentioning that or at least recognizing it. I know it was not what the topic was, the future of regulation. It wasn't a regulatory science conference. But there was, for example, a lot of discussion of hazardous air pollutants and how that program is implemented. It turns out that the database that is used to set reference dose or inhalation value for hazardous air pollutants, the Integrated Risk Information System that is run by EPA, IRIS to her friends, 67% of the HAPs that are listed in IRIS, the hazardous air pollutants, do not have inhalation values, which is sort of a mind-boggling thing when you consider that Congress listed those chemicals for better or worse in 1990. The list has been changed only at the margin, and we don't have in the leading database, the leading international database. It gets 20,000 hits per day, IRIS does. It's used all over the world. We don't have inhalation values for 67% of those chemicals, and many of them are missing. In closing, I'd just say I think we are going to have a very vigorous and lively discussion about next generation regulation. I think your behavioral economics is really interesting. I was imagining the panel, which I really enjoyed, the one that preceded this one, talking to members of Congress. I was trying to get my mind around that vision, which I think would have been very interesting, because in some ways Don and I were talking about how members of Congress really do try and figure all this out. They're not informed by studies, but I wish you'd go up there and talk to them. But one of the major features of those next generation regulations will be concern about our debt to the future. That's what climate change is. That's what endangered species has become. It's what lots of people from my end of the spectrum have on their mind. And as you do the preferences and you talk about what people would decide to do today for themselves, the fact that lots of us are going to be talking about what's going to happen to our children and our children's children is a place where I would urge you to push your thinking, because Climate change is all about that kind of change in temporal direction and concern about what's going to go on 30, 40, 50 years down the line, and the tools we have available now are just not up to the job. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rena. And just one small point of information for those who weren't here yesterday is that we did have a session on regulatory science on integrating risk assessment and risk management yesterday. Dick Morgenstern.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about reforming regulatory impact analysis, which conveniently is the title of the volume that Jonathan so graciously introduced a few moments ago. It's some work I've done with my colleague Winston Harrington and Lisa Heinzerling, who was actually one of the founding members of the center, the group that Rena leads, and she's at Georgetown Law School now on leave. The premise that we started with was work, actually reflecting work that Mike Livermore and Ricky Revesz have done, is that cost-benefit analysis is here to stay, to quote them. And the question is, how can we make it more useful to decision-making, and how can we make it more politically acceptable in the overall process in which it is part of? So what we did is we assembled a group of scholars. Several of them are here who participated actively in the process. Alan Krupnick, Scott Farrow, plus several others served as reviewers along the way. And we said, let's look at some real RIAs. Let's not look at the textbook stuff of what could or should happen. Let's see actually what happens. And let's look at 3 recent RIAs that were generally deemed to be high quality. And let's kind of tear them apart from both sides. Both sides being a set of economists who had the proposition in mind that they wanted to do purer, presumably, and better economics, and from the side of people who were members of the Center for Progressive Reform, who were very dismayed with cost-benefit analysis and who felt that it really was not a useful technique, and who had other ideas on how to proceed. So we set up this little process whereby everybody wrote papers. And then Winston and Lisa and I ended up with the task that we were going to try to develop consensus recommendations among the 3 of us. We don't blame any of the very important contributing authors for our recommendations. We take full responsibility. And we've also been criticized, in fairness, that our recommendations don't address every major philosophical issue out there. And we accept that as fair game. But we were more focused on pragmatic changes that could be made, we thought, to the process and particularly to the substance by which these RIAs are done. The 3 rules that we used as the focal point for our analysis were the CARE rule, the CAMR, the Mercury rule, and the third one was the phase 2 of the cooling water intake structures. 3 large, significant rules, all of them subjected to major court challenges, all of them relating to the electric utility industry, by the way, which is a coincidence, but it reflects somewhat the extensive data and the history involved in all these cases where there's fairly sophisticated analysis done for all these rules. So we came up with a series of 14 recommendations. And I'm not going to try to go through them all with you now, but I'll give you a flavor of them. A couple of them focused on technical quality. And here we were rather dismayed to see that a number of the RIAs we looked at least 2 of them actually, didn't consider, one not at all, one seriously, alternative options. And how can something possibly be relevant to a decision process if it doesn't consider any other than the chosen option? As Wendy Wagner, one of our authors, pointed out, this looks more like a litigation defense document than it does a decision document, and I think we readily agreed that that was the case. There were questions about the baselines chosen, and our general sense was that there needs to be a focus on choosing baselines that reveal true trade-offs and don't conceal them. And the case in point here was the Mercury rule, where in fact there was no recognition of the previous option that was clearly on the table, which was to issue a MAC regulation, and the fact that that wasn't even mentioned in the entire document struck us as disingenuous, to say the least. A further area of technical quality was really to adopt a suggestion that I first heard from Bob Hahn many years ago, and I'm sure you all are aware of it, with the idea of developing a checklist of best practices. Right now, agencies go ahead, they produce these things, and OMB reviews them to be sure, but there's nobody out there really saying, gee, there's a clear omission here, okay? It may be said in some private exchanges, but it's certainly not said in any of the public documents. So to make this manageable, we propose developing something like a top 10 list, not necessarily embodying every nuance of what's in the cost-benefit guidelines issued either by EPA or by OMB, but developing what would clearly be a list of the central practices, and really have a disclosure process whereby it's either disclosed bottom up or top down. You could even have an agency head disclose their conformance with this top 10 list, or you could have conceivably OIRA demand it. But nonetheless, there would be a process by which there was transparency about whether some basic rules of the road were adhered to. We focused on a second area was the relevance to the decision-making process. And here we found that there was, we thought there was opportunities for the agency to be a little more strategic in the elements of cost or the elements of benefits that it goes after. And we felt, for example, that in one particular rule there was a huge amount of effort, it seemed to us, put into studying emergency room visits for asthma in the care rule, where in fact that was not central to the decision at all. And there were other areas which were in fact much more important that the same resources could have been put into. So it's a little more of a kind of strategic thinking about how are we going to spend the $1 million or so that we're going to put into these studies for these $100 million or more rules. How are we going to send them a little more wisely? That's a one-time $1 million, of course, and an annualized $100 million. We also felt that there was a need to make the results of RIAs available earlier in the decision process. The standard agency routine, at least at EPA, is that the RIAs are expected to be available 3 weeks prior to decision making. Well, if you've looked at an RIA recently and you realize how many pages they are, and often how indigestible a number of pages they are, the idea that this would be relevant to a decision making process seems rather inconsistent. So our sense was that there should be a requirement that would that an agency head would require that at least 6 months prior to a decision, a memorandum should be issued by the office that is in charge of doing the RIA, stating their best judgment about the costs and about the benefits, recognizing that there are likely uncertainties 6 months ahead of time. There often are. In my own experience, I've certainly seen that. But nonetheless, have an obligation to put down on paper a clear sense of what do we know at this time. And that will have several benefits. The content itself will self-evident that it's valuable, but in addition, it will reflect, so for the whole world to see what options were actually considered, what the decision issues really are, and will just reveal a lot more about what's going on and draw a closer connection, one would hope, between the analysis and the decisions. We've got 4 other topics here. I'm not going to try to go through them all, but I'll just list off a couple of things. We thought there was a greater need for transparency. If you've looked at these RIAs lately, they're increasingly intractable. And the idea, first of all, that some of the outcomes should be expressed in physical terms, not just monetary terms. And some offices have done a better job than others in doing that. But the agency ought to be obliged to express the benefits in terms that an average person could understand them. And dollars are obviously don't always fit that bill in this case. There was a need to have greater transparency in terms of use of pure, simple English and summaries that can be much more readable by a broader audience. We thought there are some opportunities to improve the treatment of new scientific information, and there are several categories there. One of them is, simply updating guidance documents, for example, on things like the value of life, and not having what seem like long lead times between new developments in the economics literature and changes in the guidance that is offered by the agency. But also, particularly in the area of non-monetized benefits, it was our sense that the agency could do a lot more here. And certainly when there are new studies that come online, and the one that I'm most familiar with is There was some work, for example, done on ozone mortality, which was caught up in the review process and was never used officially in the RIA. Well, the agency could have developed an expedited review process for what was arguably a pretty significant study, and that could have entered into the RIA a lot more smoothly. A further issue relates really to this question of zero. And when you think about it, we have a pretty high standard that we use for benefits that we're not comfortable monetizing. And, zero is probably not the best estimate for what some of these benefits are. And one can imagine that there are processes that the agency could develop, perhaps some type of expert advice or expert review processes that would cull together a literature that's out there that might not be ready for quite the full peer-reviewed literature, but that should enter into an RIA, or could enter into an RIA, I guess we would say, in a more constructive way. Like I say, zero is probably not the best estimate, at least in some cases. Other areas where we talked about change or using a little more balance in the analysis and the process and the regulatory processes, and we also have a couple of research recommendations as well. So the volume is actually available online at the RFF website. I invite you all to take a look at it. We're hoping any day now to have hard copies for sale. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick. And last, Dick Zerbe.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. And thank you for putting on such a wonderful conference. I was giving no particular charge. I'm just going to make a few comments about some of the papers and talk a little bit about what we're doing at the real Washington. The Lotze, I believe, said something to the effect that to know what you do not know is the beginning of knowledge. And I figured I've unlearned a whole lot here, and maybe I'm starting to approach the beginning of knowledge. Certainly, I certainly learned. I don't know if you're with me or not on this, but I feel like a lot of things that I had thought may be right are perhaps questionable. And that's a good thing. That's the experiencing state instead of the remembering state where when my age tends to dwell mostly. I want to return just for a moment to Happyville. It's been pretty widely discussed, and I thought there was a crucial element that was missing in the discussion of Happyville, and that is who actually pays to remove this substance from the water that's supposed to produce cancer. We're only given the information about what the people in Happyville are willing to pay. In fact, we don't know who's going to pay. In fact, it's much more likely, perhaps, to be residents of the county who have an extra tax levied on them, or state revenues, or something like that, or a federal grant, possibly, and so on. And if you think about it just for a minute, the residents of the county, for example, have to pony up this money for what they probably will believe is a boondoggle project. They're going to have sentiments about the undesirability of this project, which ought to be calculated, therefore, in the benefit cost analysis as well. That is, they'll have a willingness to pay not to go ahead with this. And so I'm just pointing out that that who actually pays in these cases is something that you also have to take into account. Again, some minor points. Maureen mentioned not counting the altruist sentiment for the user in the cases of non-paternalistic altruism. I presume, Maureen, that comes from the work of McConnell. That turns out to be wrong, and I'll have a paper on the subject I'll be more than happy to share. The one on the general equilibrium, some of the general equilibrium papers, one paper on general equilibrium, one of the possible negative effects that can be very large in these general equilibrium models is a reduction in investment in new technology, which can have a significant effect on the growth rate that needs to be, often gives a result very, very different from the partial equilibrium rate. Yeah. On equity, there's clearly much more interest on issues of equity than there's been in any time in my memory. And I think that's a good thing. The obvious way, from a benefit cost perspective, to think about equity is to treat it as if it is another economic good for which there is a willingness to pay. And so that the measure of desirability of equity can be determined by estimates of the willingness to pay of the society for equity. I would suggest as a general proposition that any good for which there's a willingness to pay ought to be considered an economic good. One thing that bothered me a little bit about the tenure of some of the discussion, and this is hard to know what to do with this, is that there is this issue of paternalism that arises, and where we tend to think we know what's best. And I think that as a general matter, that's a somewhat dangerous tendency. I think it's very true, as Maureen said, that on estimates of the actual risk, we want to take expert estimates. I would suggest, moreover, Maureen, that is justified on the basis of that if people really realize that they're ignorant about these things, they would be willing to defer to expert judgment. So that an informed preference, actually, would be to use expert opinion in many cases where, in fact, we would agree it should be used. Now, when I was at the University of Chicago, Al Harberger taught me that the correct standard for benefit cost analyses was national. It's clear that, first, that times have changed and that there's much more pressure and interest and moral sentiment, perhaps, to take into account global effects. Well and good. The fact is that analyses that are done by political jurisdictions, whether they're cities or counties or countries, are almost always from the perspective of the particular jurisdiction. So, in practice, the question of standing is decided by who pays for the study, and it is very often not national, let alone global. One other thing that this is just a preference of mine is that we talk about utility here as if it's something that we could measure by hooking up to a utility meter or the Hodano meter in, I think, was it Young David's language. We can't measure utility. It's like the ether, and I think we ought to remove it from our vocabulary. It's very useful in modeling, but we shouldn't get confused about what it is. We could call it Mickey Mouse and use it in modeling and get the same effect. What we're trying to do is order preferences. Finally, at the Benefit Cost Center, which is at the University of Washington, we have undertaken, a la RENA, an attempt, at least an initial attempt, to try to develop principles and standards for the use of benefit cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis. Such an attempt, an exercise, properly ought to go on forever. I mean, it ought to be a living document. And so we've commissioned a series of papers. I've looked at about 80 RIAs. I'm not quarreling with the comments. However, in many cases, I did find them to be useful. a la John Graham. And in many of these cases, I found it was rather surprising that they took into account values that you might have thought have been missing, otherwise missing values. For example, in some cases they took into account sort of altruistic values that I wouldn't have thought would have been in there. And thank you.
Thank you, Dick. As part of OMB's request for public comment on the potential new executive order, which by the way, we should note how unusual that is. When the Reagan administration issued Executive Order 12291, February 1981, 10 days after inauguration, there was no public comment period. When the Clinton administration issued Executive Order 12866, September 30th, 1993, there was consultation among the executive branch but no public comment period. So it's quite, in some ways, a remarkable thing for an administration to seek public comment. Perhaps, as John Graham was suggesting, a process they may live to regret, but also one from which there can be a lot of learning. So I submitted 10 ideas, and then we had a committee of past presidents of the SRA that submitted 10 more ideas. But I just want to mention one, which is in addition to the many good ideas that all of the panelists have mentioned and the many sessions we've had here already, there's one that we haven't discussed, which is the institutional innovation of using benefit cost analysis in regulatory oversight to say yes as well as to say no. That is the institutional innovation of something like prompt letters. Whereas historically, OIRA had operated by receiving proposals from agencies and sometimes issuing return letters or otherwise trying to discourage bad regulation by whoever's criteria. The alternative, or the counterpart really, is to issue to use benefit cost analysis to identify promising opportunities and issue a prompt letter to an agency to say this is something that looks like you should be paying more attention to it. And that's an innovation that that John Graham introduced when he was administrator of OIRA, but to date has been very ad hoc. So the one idea I just want to add to our consideration is whether there's a way to be more systematic about using an appropriately enlightened version of benefit cost analysis, considering all the discussion we've had over the last 2 days and others, to say yes as well as no, that is, to use it for the purpose of improving social well-being, which should be one of its core goals, and also thereby to do what Michael Livermore was suggesting, which is help build the constituency in favor of analytic methods of speaking expert analysis to power, of using benefit cost analysis constructively. So with that, let me invite anyone who wants to respond to any of the panelists or to add another suggestion or comment that hasn't been raised yet.
Thank you. I'm not going to stand up. My knees are hurting.
No, that's fine, but could you just identify yourself?
Yeah, I will. Rick Belzer, Regulatory Checkbook. I think there's room for a reform that possibly all of you would agree on, and that alone, could be quite remarkable. But there's a lot of comment about RAs being delivered late and being delivered too thick for decision making, and it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I think Dick Morgenstern, you may have been part of the regulatory analysis or the regulatory blueprint movement, such as it was. I think that was primarily focused on getting the outlines of the regulation laid out early and publicly. But let's take a step back and talk about getting the outline of the RAA laid out publicly and early, with all the data revealed, the analytic methods revealed, the models made transparent, and do that at least a year before the proposal is going to go to OMB. And let everybody have at it, so that it's no longer just an agency product. Let's see some competition in analytic quality so that Rena's group can look at it too, and they can comment very effectively. And because a lot of these things aren't that complicated. The kinds of errors that seem to pop up, as you've just mentioned, are relatively simple ones, like not looking at alternatives. Things that are easily preventable at a very early stage, but for some reason they're not. But if this is put out openly and early, so that everybody can participate and done very publicly, then the quality of analysis throughout regulatory development would improve dramatically, I believe, from the effective competition and the weakening of the conflict of interest that agencies always have when they are doing analysis in support of their own programs. Whereas the best critics out there are going to be your opponents. The best peer reviewers are those who don't agree, the ones who are the most skeptical. Let's get that out in the open and have at it, instead of continuing to bottle up that process until the end when the decision's already been made.
Why don't I just let panelists comment or respond to that if you want, and also to anything else that was raised earlier that you want to comment on, and then take some more questions. Dick.
Yeah, I would just say, Rick, I mean, I'm actually pretty sympathetic in spirit to your suggestion. I think the question, I guess I'd be putting on a very, very old hat that I was wearing with more hair, to be sure, when I was at EPA. But putting on that hat, I guess I would respond with that hat by saying that the actual process of an agency doing an analysis and getting it together is remarkably complex and cumbersome. And some offices seem to do it a little easier, a little more swiftly than others, I'll grant you. But the idea of doing that a year beforehand and having a whole analysis out there, given the timelines that exist in agencies, might just include a blueprint. Well, the blueprint, at least as I remember the blueprint, is much more focused on kind of inputs, and it wasn't focused on really assembling all the pieces. And I think the elegance of your suggestion is that you really, when you have the whole piece, the whole study together with all the complex parts, you understand the models and so on, you can actually have an outside judgment. I just wonder how you can make it practical. That's kind of, that's kind of my response, but maybe other people have a different view.
Just a quick thought. I think that certainly the motivation behind your suggestion, which is that RIA should be better integrated into the decision-making process, I think is something that you would find universal agreement with. I think that the question becomes, how do you do that? And I think one of the values that kind of complicates this story, there's several complications in the story, but one of them is that agencies are very interested in making clear the decisions that are made by the agency and the decisions that are made by OIRA and OMB. Something that you hear agency folks talk about a lot, something that folks in the advocacy community talk about a lot, is they really want to make it clear when OIRA is changing a regulation, when it's the agency that's making the decision. And that value of kind of allocating responsibility to changes along the course of regulation really makes it much more complicated to integrate regulatory impact analysis and cost-benefit analysis into the decision. Because really what you would want is something that was evolving over time. You would want an analysis, and then you would respond to the analysis and make changes. You would do further analysis. That would be like some kind of optimal decision-making procedure, but that's very difficult to do, for just resource constraint reasons, but also because of this issue that, the agency, they might not want to make changes that OIRA makes, and then they want to make it very clear that it's OMB making this call and not them. And then once you start to have that push-pull, it becomes less of a collaborative process. It actually really makes the dynamic, it problematizes the dynamic and pushes off RIA into that kind of final, let's justify the regulation piece, which isn't really where it's done its most useful.
Just quickly, I agree intellectually it's a great idea. My experience from inside is that, on the one hand, the lawyers will conspire against you because they don't want to create any paper trails until they know what it is we're going to do. Okay, and then they want the paper trails to build the case. So if you do this sort of open intellectual process, it's not that orderly. And then I think you also have the political people who are worried about, for example, how many times as the Obama administration are we going to hit, say, the coal industry or the auto industry? Okay, and there are Democratic senators in these states that care about these, as well as Republican senators. There has to be some calculation here about, what are we going to do? This is the way those people think. Okay, not cost-benefit analysis like this conference thinks about it, but cost-benefit analysis politically. Okay, well, if you have this stuff that's sort of loosely out there and we're talking about it, we're doing analysis, we're scaring the daylights out of all these people. I all think they're going to get hit. Okay, what are you guys doing? So I think that the approach is not politically realistic. Okay, or legally realistic. But on the other hand, I think one of the interesting things about the value of the RIAs, even when they come late, even when they didn't inform the decision, is you now have judges and members of Congress who are reading these analyses, and in some cases there have been some interesting court decisions where they've said, hey, we read this RIA, and we thought it supported something else or whatever. And I think this is constructive because if we can get the judicial review side at least more cost-benefit oriented in the way this conference is, the way they think about arbitrary and capricious decision-making, it can then induce the agencies to go more in the direction you're talking about. And I think some of the recent court decisions may have that effect.
Mark has a question in the back.
Hi, this is Brian Hubbell with EPA again. On that issue, let me just point out that one of the things that Dick and the others in that analysis kept saying is, well, the analysts are making these technical choices not to look at alternatives or to choose a particular baseline. And follow on with what's just made, the RIA is a political document. It is not simply a policy analysis. Because of that, it has certain political or policy dimensions, and those happen to be the two things you mentioned, which is the alternatives that you look at and the baseline that you compare it to. Those are not decisions that the analyst makes. There's the things we can propose, and we can say out, we think you should look at these things. But those are not choices that we make. Those are choices that are given to us by the political or the policy process. So one thing to understand is that the decision-making process is not geared, within the agencies, is not geared around the RIA. The RIA is a result of the decision-making process. As much as I'd like it to be something else, many times it is not the way that it works. And we're all fooling ourselves if we assume that that's the decision-making structure. It may be what we'd like to be. It's our normative approach. But the revealed preference is not for using RIAs. So I think we just have to be careful about making those statements. That's right. The second thing I want to make the point of is that there may be different roles where RIAs and cost-benefit analysis can have a more positive effect. And identifying those opportunities and using those opportunities to push forward the purpose of cost-benefit analysis may be something that we can do better. Picking on NACs and saying, well, we need to do the perfect cost-benefit analysis for a NACs where it can't be used is probably not the right way to do it. Using it in something like CARE or something like a non-road diesel rule where you can look at stringency and other things that might be informed by it, that's potentially a really good use for it. And I think the other thing that John did when he was there, which I think was very useful, is to say, let's look at past RIAs as potentially a way to think and identify where additional things can be done. And I think John has made the point in his article that looking at what was done for the heavy-duty engine rule, where we identified very large benefits relative to the cost, helped to guide his support for doing the non-road diesel rule. So I think those are important things to think about.
Okay, thank you for those comments. I know there are other people who've been waiting. So,
U.S. Department of Agriculture. A question for Raina and possibly also for Richard Zerba. Raina, you mentioned the importance of debt to the future and that you thought the Obama administration would give a lot of importance to that. That raises to my mind the whole question of discount rates. And I'm kind of surprised that in these couple of days we haven't had a much deeper discussion about discount rates. The benefits that occur 40 or 50 or 60 years in the future when you apply usual discount rates come down to virtually zero at present value. Right? But economists, near as I can see, just about always use discount rates. It's almost an unwritten law. Does that need to change?
Well,
Can I? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Robbie, real quick. I have written, as have many of my colleagues, that there is no justification for discounting the future. And you will see if you listen carefully to the debate that a lot of people who advocate new legislation on climate change are very concerned. I've heard Ricky say this, very concerned about how we would project the value of changes that will occur in 50 to 60 years, both on the cost and the benefit side. So, my position is fairly simple. I agree with you. If you carry discounting out beyond a certain period of time, the value of everything disappears. And you did say one thing that I hope you're right on, but that I didn't say, and that is that the Obama administration will be very concerned about our debt to the future. The president has expressed a lot of commitment to climate change legislation, but the proof will still be in the pudding on that. I'd be very interested to hear when he finally gets confirmed, as I expect he will be, what Cass Sunstein thinks about that issue. He's a very strong supporter of climate change controls. But I was saying that people from my end of the world are talking in terms of next generation about future. The debt to the future is a big preoccupation.
Thank you. I would like to speak to the issue. It seems to me that those who advocate not using the discount rate, given that there's certainly a lot of uncertainty about the discount rate, the people who advocate don't really understand the economics of it. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to build in moral sentiments about our concern for the future into the discount rate. Well, the way to do that is not to load it into the discount rate, but to count it up front in the benefit cost analysis. That is to say, RENA's concern about the future will have a willingness to pay associated with it, or a willingness to accept, depending on where our baseline is. The very fact that the advocates on moral grounds advocate the zero discount rate show the moral concern. That could be measured and it be included directly in the analysis instead of leading to the considerable problems and biases that will result from not using a discount rate.
Just really quick on that. I think one of the reasons that, you mentioned that there hasn't been a deeper discussion. I think one of the reasons that we haven't had is because they don't tend to go anywhere when you have discussions of the discount rate. You kind of just have two different parties, and we haven't made a lot of progress on that.
I think we're about to.
Okay.
I want to come back to a point that Brian made, which is that, and I don't know in the other areas of regulation, only in the areas of environmental regulation, there are very few environmental regulations that are ever set on a benefit cost criteria. In fact, most of them preclude consideration of benefits or costs. So it would be unusual if the rulemaking process ever allowed an evaluation of an ongoing benefit cost analysis, and I think this elaborates on something John suggested, as part of the deliberations associated with deciding on the rule. The rule, in some sense, has to be decided in advance of the RIA, or at least that's the theory. What I wanted to raise is a different issue that bears on the interactions associated with the RIA. Over the years, one of the aspects that I found very encouraging about EPA's work is the role of the Science Advisory Board and its various committees in trying to make recommendations both on the science and on the engineering and now even on the economics of best practice. And I wonder if that wouldn't be a constructive suggestion for other regulatory agencies and for OIRA to have an advisory board on best practice and science, whether it's in the development of the RIAs or in the coordination and cross-agency evaluation of RIAs. And I would be interested in the panelists' reaction to that.
That's a good idea.
Just a quick reaction on a couple points. Before the break, Kara, you mentioned that it was your impression that most benefit cost analyses are done in cases of environmental externality, not where private interests are both bearing the cost and reaping the benefit. I just want to remind you that there are agencies such as the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Airline Safety Regulatory Agency, the Food and Drug Administration process, all which have cost-benefit, which are actually in the case that you described. So environmental decision-making oftentimes is described in the way you handle it, but I just want to alert you that there's cost-benefit analysis done on purely private matters where the government's taking paternalistic acts on behalf of citizens on the theory that they can do better than the individuals can do for themselves. The other point is this question of whether the law permits these regulators to consider costs and benefits. My experience inside the government is in these cases you can get lawyers of all stripes give you all sorts of different answers. It's not entirely clear before a lot of these decisions which lawyer was right. Okay? So as a practical matter, the way Cass Sunstein has written about this, which is kind of interesting, he says there's kind of a default kind of rule of thumb that's developed. Is if the law doesn't speak like explicitly to the issue, then the courts are probably going to allow the regulators to think about the costs and benefits. And in fact, there was a Supreme Court decision recently on the cooling water intake structure rule, which was one I was in the midst of, where they were telling me you're not allowed to consider costs. Others said yes, you can consider costs. DOE lawyers said you could. EPA lawyers said you couldn't. Well, we did, and we wrote a rule, and we just took the risk that there would be a court that would somewhere out there say it might be all right. And we all went all the way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately in that case they said yes. But all the stuff about what the law permits and doesn't permit, it's not at all clear in a lot of these cases.
Can I just, I agree with you, and I appreciate the hostility toward my profession that everybody is expressing. I do appreciate that.
I'm with you, Rena.
Yeah. You appreciate it too, Jonathan, huh? But I would say that Cass Sunstein, in his nomination hearing, very clearly said that he did not think cost-benefit analysis was appropriate in the context of what the speaker was talking about, national ambient air quality standards. That's not to say that John is making a terrific point that there are other statutory provisions that do allow it and in some cases even require it.
I want to follow up with that for a second. There is a Supreme Court decision on that point. We understand that. But it seems to me a comment that I heard from Kerry, from Brian, and from John was whether or not these RIAs are actually designed to be, or should they be, I guess it was a kind of value judgment, should they be involved in decision making? And I guess I heard a number of people saying no for different sets of reasons that were advanced. And I guess I want to take the other side, okay? And, I got just a couple of simple observations. First of all, I think a clear reading of the executive order suggests that they are to be considered. The fact that they are to be completed before a rule is done sort of begs the question, well, why do it before a rule is done if it's not going to be used? Some statutes clearly require, but most allow, and there are a few exceptions, and we've kind of duly noted that. And in my experience in the agency is that RIAs are considered to the extent they are allowed by the law. And the fact that we would do one that was that didn't consider options, it just seems completely ridiculous, okay? And I think that, so, if this is going to just be a total after-the-fact academic exercise, then I think we ought to, change the label and change a few other things about it, because it either is relevant or it's not relevant. And right now, we're kind of speaking out of both sides of our mouth.
So it's been interesting in these last 2 days that the financial crisis really hasn't been mentioned very much in the context of a lot of the discussion. And so I want to put that on the table in the following sense. It seems to me, and I think from discussions with some others, that we have a real opportunity with the financial crisis to do things in a different way. And everyone has been talking about that. And the question that I'd like to pose to the panel is there an opportunity to sort of see the challenges that we've had on the behavioral side, the fact that people have not paid attention to a certain set of events. They've managed to say it's not going to happen on my watch. We have a little acronym that we like to use for that. I'll throw out, hasn't been used here, NIMTOF.
Not in my term of office.
Not in my term of office. In some fashion, pretending, hoping it won't happen, and yet we know it may happen. And as a result of that, we're sort of asking ourselves a set of questions today that we really haven't posed in quite this manner in the past. And the question that comes up, at least is it rational for a lot of firms to somehow say, look, we're going to ignore these low probability events because if we pay attention to them, if we put in the funds and the resources to deal with them, we've already lost our comparative advantage, or with the level playing field, we're on the bottom of the totem pole. The others who haven't done that are going to come out ahead at the end of the day because of the fact that they can charge less for their product or do a variety of things that put them in that situation. And so everyone is now asking, or people are asking, is there a level playing field we have to have? So the question for the panel is there a role for what is the appropriate role for OIRA and maybe other organizations that focus on OIRA to play in the context of regulations that may or may not may establish a more level playing field, so that one would say if people will take this action, they will not find themselves in a position where they're asking themselves, are we going to lose big if these events do not happen? And as a result, decide that they may not want to do it. Richard Posner has said a bit about that, I think, in a book that either is coming out or will come out in the near future. So I want to just throw that out. Is there a role to play in this cost-benefit analysis? Have something to say on that.
Just to kind of open that, I think that one of the major challenges that's faced by kind of integrating OIRA and cost-benefit analysis into the regulation of financial institutions is that the positive economics piece is not there. It's developing. We don't know the effects of regulation on financial institutions of the type that we're talking about in changing their risk portfolios and so on and so forth. I think that that's really where there's room for development. Lots, and people are trying, obviously, thinking about this very hard, but then integrating that into a cost-benefit analysis, I think once we have the positive economics figured out, that's easy to plug it into the normative cost-benefit analysis. It's really characterizing the risk, understanding what the consequences of our regulatory activities are. That's the hard part. And then otherwise, it's fairly easy. I think that, and the concern that I would express about OIRA, and in general, I think it's good for them to be involved, but my concern in this area is that they not become an obstructing force, that they play like an equal role, that they see their job not to slow down regulation in this area or to speed it up, but to achieve some kind of balanced, intelligent approach to regulating in this area. So I think that would be kind of my couple of initial thoughts.
Just real quick, OIRA doesn't have jurisdiction over independent agencies. Some people want to change that, but a lot of the financial agencies, like the SEC, for example, is independent. I will say that Cass Sunstein, who has been sitting in the White House for many months now, many people see his hand in the most recent package of financial consumer protections. A lot of his writing is reflected in the proposed powers for the new agency. So he is a roving ambassador for these ideas, whether or not OIRA has jurisdiction, as one would expect. I'm sure John did that too. Did you do that?
Never.
Just a logistical issue. The recorder has asked that we switch to the one mic that is not cutting out, so we'll have to go back and forth with the mics in the crowd.
And I know, Mark, we have several people up here who've been waiting to ask questions.
And so we went to this side, and we'll go to this side. And
then, up to you,
and this will be next.
Thank you. Hi. I am very happy to have the opportunity to spend the last 2 days here. I think I should consider myself privileged. There's a whole bunch of other economists out there that are not here and weren't able to, get all this stellar minds here all at once. I'm truly, my thinking process is truly provoked. And I have a few questions. Actually, I had a million of them, but I'm just going to pick the top.
Because we have several people.
Right. As an economist at FDA, there's appreciable efforts that we need to go through to get our input early in the policymaking process. When somebody's thinking about something such as integrating the risk assessment in the cost-benefit analysis and using the cost-benefit analysis with the risk assessment, so we need to work with the scientists and get acceptance from them and then they say they don't really like the idea of trading health for cash, and so that's a whole little education experience that we need to constantly engage in. I've been doing that for 18 years. Discounting is another one, and I find myself at a loss as what's the best way to really, gain acceptance from non-economists on discounting. And to complicate things a little more, I've recently come across a flurry of literature on spatial discounting, and which makes total sense. I care more what happens in my backyard than in somebody else's. And so in trade issues and cost-benefit analysis, we're very U.S.-centric, and so, we need to consider, is there a spatial discounting component that we should consider as well in our decision-making process? I know that sounded like a real loaded question, but, I'd like your thoughts on this.
Just briefly, with my students, I use some paradoxes that Milt Weinstein, a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, uses in his classes as well. And they're written up in this little Penn Law Review piece. And there's also some citations into the law review literature where the advocates of zero discounting dispute these paradoxes. So you can get a little flavor for whether you think it really works or not. But nonetheless, there are some people who've been thinking about those paradoxes as a way to explain this to non-technically oriented folk. These are paradoxes if you really were to live your life with zero discount rates.
Okay. Another question?
I'd like to ask a question. Dick, it is to reinforce, I think, what you and your panel have said about RIAs, that if they were more transparent, but I think the critical thing, and I think Brian touched on it, is more thought about how these analyses are integrated into the decision-making process. If you get the analysis done 6 months early, but nobody pays attention to it, you've kind of played half the game. And it seems to me the real benefit of the cost-benefit analysis, the complicated ones on the big regs that I've seen, was that as we went along, we got different insights, and the process changed dramatically as it went along. And so better transparency, all of the things you talked about, a better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses, getting away from single-point source estimates and getting kind of into the heart of what drives the assumption, the analysis, would be much more helpful in making it useful to decision makers. And I don't think there was much discussion in the last 2 days about how a decision maker would take this information and use it. And I think that might help in the future. Comments?
Yes, and you're reminding me, I wanted to comment on Dick's point about the frustration he has with us speaking out of both sides of our mouth. And I think I wanted to clarify that I think what was being said was that there are ways in which RIAs have value and contribute to the process that are outside the immediate interface between the analyst in an agency and the assistant administrator or whatever in that agency. They're at the judicial review stage of the legislative review process. There was an example Brian, I think, gave where OMB was persuaded because of an analysis on one rule that there might be a reason to have another rule. Okay, so totally unrelated to the RIA that it was done for, the rule it was done for. And I think that it's helpful to have that context because the political and the legal pressures and the communication pressures around a lot of these big rules to allow the RIA influence to happen there, they're always going to constrain it a lot. So don't feel so frustrated. And it's not speaking out of both sides of your mouth. It's recognizing democracy in its larger sense and how information is playing a role.
Just to add briefly onto that, I agree with John. I think that also there's the context of kind of regulating in the shadow of the RIA. So even if you aren't in the process of conducting an RIA constantly while you're figuring out your regulation, you still know at the end of the day that you're going to have to prepare a document that's going to be reviewed by courts, and that is likely to have a backward influence on the process. Although, that is not necessarily optimal.
Yeah, John, I would just say I agree with your point completely. There clearly is value for the RIA beyond the specific decision in all the ways that you just outlined. I guess the question, is there any value for it in the decision? And I'm kind of saying that...
It depends. It depends, and it varies enormously.
Sure. Okay. That's a good way to resolve it.
I just had two other quick data points. One is that the same discussion goes on about environmental impact statements required under NEPA and whether they have significant influence in decisions or should, or whether they're just stapled onto the back of a decision that was already made, or whether in the shadow, the information base building up over time, they have a change in the culture. And the other is that in the European Union, as Alberto Alemano has written about, not only are impact assessments now required more recently than in the U.S., but now required in the EU institutions, but the European Court of Justice a couple of years ago issued a decision essentially saying that under a principle of European law called the proportionality principle, an impact assessment is required. It's somewhat similar to as if courts in the United States said that under the arbitrary and capriciousness standard of the Administrative Procedure Act, an RIA was required.
I just want to make a very brief comment in this connection, which is that I think that, Lisa, you were very wise to invite some of the European colleagues, the French people here and so on.
Lou Perlman, RSI. I had a partial counter-argument to John's earlier observations about realpolitik and how the law works. I don't want to use up my mic time because I had a general thought reinforcing, I think, partially at least, Dick Morgenstern's observation and my friend's here. It seemed to me for a very long time, for 30-plus years, that there's a useful distinction in my mind between cost-benefit analysis and cost-benefit accounting. I think it's a very good thing to study and understand all the different impacts and costs and benefits and whose ox gets gored and how and why and stakeholders and interests and report those to the public granularly. The analysis part, which my colleague here does so brilliantly, is crunching all that into some sort of abstract mathematical formula which tends to obfuscate and obscure to the public understanding what the hell is really at stake. The distinction pragmatically in my mind I just thought of is just in Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia. We are, to the mullah's discomfort in Tehran, we have long since transitioned to an age where, as Obama, one of the things I do like that he says is the public can be trusted with complexity. And as Baruch noted yesterday, people are more capable than we give them credit for if we share the information we have. And so I'd like to see more of that and less expert peer review, number crunching, and we know the answers, and we're from the government, we're here to tell you what's good for you. If I haven't used up all my time, just a quick counter example of John's point is some of you may remember CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. This is my point about my discomfort with government by formula or algorithm. You may recall a few years ago there was a proposal for the Emir of Dubai to purchase 6 U.S. port facilities. The CFIUS committee is a bureaucratic group which is charged by law to review all such purchases according to a formula to determine whether there's a threat to the national security of the United States. This committee of a dozen or so bureaucrats got together. They went through the check boxes. They did all the formulas. They could not find any tangible evidence of a threat to the security, so they just checked it off and passed it on. None of them in the room ever thought to say, gee, an Arab sheik buying 6 U.S. ports in the post-9/11 world might create a political problem for the president. Maybe we should call the White House and give him a heads up. As earlier presentation, that sort of distinction between common sense and algorithm. So we don't really want more of that sort of thing. We would like people to be able to be human and to think and to have some empathy, another idea the president likes, and to share, as you were saying, more transparently what we think we know, what our doubts are, and let other people debate and decide.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more, maybe two.
I'll be quick.
Okay. All right. Let's let this be the last then.
I've been hearing both in the panel just now and over the course of the day a lot about benefit cost analysis as it should be practiced, as it should be used, when it should be performed, how we can integrate distributional concerns into it, what values we should use. And I think to some extent we've been dancing around a sort of a fundamental question, which I think is probably a philosophical and ideological question or perspective that underlies everyone's views on this. And so I'd just like to ask the panel briefly if they have a sense of, what I think is underlying is the question of what is a good decision. In other words, if we say benefit cost analysis should be used this way or not be used that way, we have an implicit notion, I think, of what we think would be a good decision or a decision that we'd want to come up with. So I was wondering if the panel has sort of a brief one-sentence notion of what they would call a good decision.
When you're up for Senate confirmation, it's that I implemented the statute. I didn't do anything else. I just did what Congress told me to do.
No, I think John's absolutely right. I was going to say something along those lines, that essentially, a decision maker is not bound by the results of a benefit cost analysis. I can't think of maybe there are some statutes, but I guess there are a few, but most of the ones we deal with don't fall in that category. But this is designed to shed light on the issue.
It's 5:15. I think that might be a good decision. I want to thank. Let me just thank all our. Let me thank all the panelists and all the speakers throughout the 2 days, Paul Portney and Sally Katzen, and thank all of you for attending and RFF for hosting us, and thanks to Lisa Robinson for organizing the whole thing.